Um, Always remember that you should be dressed when you're on Zoom, because you don't want to be something unfriendly to happen. Second of all, um, please mute yourself. And if you're not one of the speakers or during the discussion periods, you're not one of the discussants, please keep yourself on mute. I don't want to have to mute everybody forcefully. I don't want to have to kick people out. So let's try to do this on our own. And we will have time for questions at the end of each session. And again, at the end of the last third session, later on in the today, there will be open for general discussion. So please save your questions for the end. And if you do want to write a question during the talk, during a session, so write it in a chat and make sure that you write to who the question is, so that at the end we can get this together. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to ask Matt Adams, the director of the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research, to give the first paper of the first session, the stratigraphy of Megiddo, cultic structures in the EB2, 3, and IB. Matt, please, all yours.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks also, Shira and Christina. I'm happy to be here and hear all these great papers today. As you'll see, I changed my topic slightly from what is in the abstract book. I expanded it into the Intermediate Bronze Age because I want to cover a few things that I think are important, especially if I get to give the first paper of the session. Megiddo's always been kind of the type site that has set the bar for the stratigraphy of cult in the third millennium, and I want to make sure I cover a few things that I think are important. Some of this will be a rehash of things I've said before. Some of it is changing my mind slightly on a few issues, and there's also some new material in here as well. And hopefully a couple of the other papers later on will touch on some of the things that I'll speak about as well. Hopefully you all know where Megiddo is at this point, but I have to show the map slide, of course. And Megiddo, there she is in all of her glory after the 2018 season. We're, of course, interested in Area BB of the University of Chicago excavations, or Area J from the current Tel Aviv University excavations, which has carried out excavations in the cultic area from 1992 to 2010. At this point, we consider this area complete, though there's always talk about going back and doing that one last small project there. Here are a few different views of Area BB in the cultic area. Many of you should be familiar with this by now. Great. So as you know, there's quite a long sequence of temples and cult buildings that go all the way from now the Chalcolithic period. We do have some Chalcolithic evidence underneath the big temple, which I'll mention briefly a little bit later, all the way through the Iron II and perhaps beyond. Very quickly, let's go over the standard stratification of the area in what we call levels J2 and J3, or the University of Chicago Stratum 19 is, of course, the famous Stratum 19 temple in your upper left corner with its famous Megiddo picture pavement, the small broad room temple, which all of you know. This is succeeded by what we have called the Great Temple of level J4, also dating to the very late EB1B, or if you're using the arcane terminology, I would put this into ESL 3. Great. We had an opportunity back in 2010 now, it's a long time ago, to do a sounding beneath the Great Temple. Here we dug down about 1.5 meters, encountering roughly 3 major strata, as well as some substrata as well. You can read about this in the report published in Megiddo 5. And we will have some additional publications coming out on this material later. Suffice to say for the moment that we do seem to have Chalcolithic Early Bronze 1 transition and early parts of the Early Bronze Age 1, and we'll be presenting that ceramic sequence a little bit later. It's a small sondage equivalent to about 2 squares, but there are significant architectural remains beneath the Great Temple, including a large wall, which we suspect is an earlier temple, perhaps contemporary with stratum 19 as well as some earlier kind of funky architectural things as well. That's, of course, not the subject for today's talk. The J4 temple was abandoned. We have said in previous reports that this abandonment may have lasted for the duration of what we call the EB2. More recently, I've suggested that this abandonment was actually a very short-lived period and that the site probably was not abandoned during this period, but the temple was abandoned in the process of preparing for the construction of the next major stratum there, which is this you see here, Chicago stratum 17 and 16, which we will talk about as one unit for the purposes of this discussion. This is basically one stratum with several rebuilds. Chicago identified 2 or 3 subphases. We have identified 3 or so as well in our excavations, but these subphases are really architectural subphases in different parts of the larger complex that we're going to be discussing. This EB2/EB3 period is replaced by the famous Triple Temple complex that is currently at the surface today, including the large round altar. And I'll be talking about all of these, the sequence from J5, 6, and 7 over the next several slides. Okay. I don't know why I put this in here. I always feel obligated to show this temple, but I'm sick of talking about it. So here's the image for you. What I just want to say at this point is that this temple, as I've already alluded to, was abandoned for what I think is a very short period of time and intentionally dismantled. I've also presented some of this in the Megiddo 5 publication and elsewhere as well. I won't rehash it here. It does look like the walls were systematically dismantled. The corridors of the building and the sanctuary itself were filled up with the bricks from the upper parts of the temple, and the entire area was thus leveled in anticipation of the next building project. Here you see a section through the temple. On your upper left, you see the temple itself, and in the upper right, you see the EB2/3 new stratum with the round altar there. And what I want to point out at this point in time in the section on the bottom is, I think you can see my cursor, right? My arrow? Okay, great. Is the larger walls constituting the J4 temple here. In striated lines, this fill, which covered the entire building complex, and the new stratum J5, J6 architecture on top. And I want you to take note at this point that this leveling, while it did create pockets of levelness, the entire new stratum is built on a slope, and thus all of the architecture from north to south, that is from left to right in this image, is terraced upward toward the south. And as we'll see a little bit later, there is a slope dramatically also to the west, which was also terraced, such that the altar 4017 really was at the high point of the site during this period. And even though all the plans appear to show relatively level construction, there are dramatic slopes which need to be taken into account, and that's important. Okay, Chicago had already exposed a significant portion of this level, stratum 17 and 16. Palace 3177 on the right-hand side of your screen is, of course, very well known, comparable perhaps to the palace at Yarmout palaces. The altar 4017 at the very center of the plan is, of course, also very well known, and I will be focusing in on that a little bit shortly. Chicago already in their excavations found remains of animal bones around this altar, and our excavations, especially in the late 90s and very early 2000s, uncovered a sequence of bone deposits around and beneath this altar as well. Unfortunately, these bones have not been thoroughly studied, and I won't be able to present them today. Okay. Just a few quick views of building 3177. Take note of the fine plastered walls in some of the rooms, the pavement of cobblestones in some of the rooms, the pillar bases that appear in 2 of the rooms. Here's one example here. Very nice and similar to those that are later used or perhaps reused from this building in the Triple Temple complex. Okay. More or less, the building 3177 and the altar were exclusively the work of the University of Chicago without much else having been revealed. Our excavations focused on these 2 areas in red in the 2000s, and were able to uncover significantly more of this stratum. Here's a composite image showing you our excavations plus the University of Chicago's material as well. Okay, one thing I want to say right from the outset is that this stratum, despite its 3 subphases and the following Triple Temple complex, are definitely two distinct strata. Our excavations, especially in this northern part of the area and again over here, showed that conclusively. And some of the details you can read about in Megiddo 5 and in some upcoming publications as well. I say this right now because over the years prior to our excavations, there have been several attempts to kind of re-stratify 17, 16, and 15 in order to make better sense of the stratigraphy of cult there. And just to mention a few examples, Kempinski, whose image you see on the left, and Pierre de Mirochegi, who doesn't have an image here at all, have tried to show that the triple complex was in fact incrementally constructed such that Temple 4040 may have coexisted with building 3177 and the early constructions of the altar as well, with the twin temples constructed slightly later. I think we've conclusively shown that this is not the case, that these 3 temples were all built at the same time in the aftermath of the earlier EB3 strata, and that there was no overlap. We'll come back to a few points on that in just a moment. A few things about the cultic landscape of the EB2-3 strata. First of all, the altar, which I've mentioned on a couple of occasions. During our 2010 excavations, where we focused on the area of this arrow here, I believe that we've been able to identify the long lost temple belonging to this stratum, especially if we had already been able to show that the triple temple complex is certainly later. Chicago had uncovered part of this building. It does show up in part of their plans. We re-excavated it and found this very nice building with internal white plastering of both the floors and the walls. I think I have an image coming up in just a moment. Yeah, here we go. The remains of a pillar base, which we could no longer see, but with Chicago had shown on their plans as well. And the entire building was completely cut by the twin temples, which were constructed later. That's why we only have this portion here. In this stratum, and in fact, the earlier EB1 strata as well, the only buildings that have this kind of attention to, or this kind of plaster, are a few of the rooms in Palace 3177 and the earlier temple, Stratum 19, and the J4 temple itself. Taking this fragment of building that we have and reconstructing a mirror image, I suggested that we in fact have a temple here, which would in fact, here's an example of the column base from building 3177, just to illustrate what Chicago seems to have described as the same pillar base inside of this building here, same look. Good, so the finding of this type of temple adjacent to altar 4017 brings us much more in alignment with the cultic landscape that we see at Zerakun, in which we do have another round altar type thing, in addition to 1, 2, or possibly 3 other temple structures here. And you'll note that the morphology of this building with its main cella and this porch, which is somewhat different from the porches of the later triple temple complex, including with porch columns, entrance columns, is much more in line with those at Zerakun here as well. A few other things I want to point out that are not necessarily cultic, but are cool anyway. And if you want to interpret them as cultic, not that one, we'll go to the northern part of the area as well. We found one elaborate room with an elaborate floor paved with the sherds, very red burnished sherds. You see some examples of them here. All were able to be reconstructed. These were not broken on the floor and scattered around. These were really laid, broken and used as a pavement for the entire room here. These type of vessels can be found in the northern Jordan Valley and upwards into Syria as well with this reserved burnishing. The illustration here stands for several similar vessels, some of which are illustrated here on the right. Also in an adjacent room, we found a few Egyptian items, including this mace head and this earlier Nagata 2 or early Nagata 3 style cylinder seal published by Baruch Brandel in Megiddo 5. And the same room that had both of these objects also had dozens and dozens and dozens piles of these types of lamps, which are illustrated here, all with soot around the rim and all having one, in addition to their shape, one major thing in common, a very similar type of fabric that I have called the fine pinkish fabric. These things are really beautiful, and I'm sorry I don't have an image for you. I couldn't scrounge one up. It's this white fabric with enough pink inclusions and other sparkly bits that they look very pretty, almost stone vessel-like. Okay, so that's Megiddo in the EB2-3 as we know it. I think we've added quite a bit, especially to this upper level here. There's the palace is down on a lower terrace. There is evidence of a staircase here leading up to this upper portion. I assume this is an extension of the city. You see that it's characterized by these two long streets. There are probably others here. The central area has been almost completely destroyed by the later Triple Temple complex. Okay, now to take us to the Triple Temple complex, of course, we very often focus on the three temples here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these features behind the twin temples. We'll talk about the altar, of course, and I won't talk about it in great detail, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Megiddo during this phase is not just these triple temples. There's something more elaborate going on site-wide. The terrace, which previously held the palace, is now replaced by a large monumental staircase with at least two sets of stairs going up and ascending to the major part of the Acropolis as well. We're now in a position in our excavations, which will hopefully take place this summer, near the main gate area to encounter this intermediate Bronze Age stratum yet again. And hopefully next time we have a meeting, I'll be able to tell you if the intermediate Bronze Age really does cover the entirety of what we know as Tel Megiddo, which I think will be the case. Okay, of course, since Chicago published them, as you see in this plan here, the Altar 4017 has always been included and understood to be part of this cultic complex. Here's an updated drawing, stone for stone drawing that we've done in the field, which covers much of what Chicago had seen, a few other items as well, plus our own excavations in the western wall of the Western temple. There wasn't a whole lot that we could add to these particular buildings. This is the last stratum that Chicago reached in this particular area, having exposed most of these temples before quitting work in the 1930s. There were a few places we could probe, as I've already indicated, our excavations here in the western wall, so to speak. And we also did a sondage in the threshold of Temple 4040, which you can see here. Here you see what that sondage looked like. And what we did, in fact, encounter was the floor of the building still preserved, which it is inside most of Temple 4040, except where we excavated later. We were able to find the foundation trench for the wall, which was contiguous across the entirety of the front wall. I suppose around the other walls as well, though we didn't check that either. Most importantly, we were able to take pottery from within this foundation trench. Also, this was all published in Megiddo 5. You can see some of the forms here, especially this envelope-shaped ledge handle with, with this very distinctive greenish marl fabric, which is characteristic of intermediate Bronze Age vessels at Megiddo, but also further abroad in the north, and especially the Jezreel Valley. So this was one of our first inklings, and the first time that we started to suggest that these buildings may in fact be intermediate Bronze Age. I should say at this point that that suggestion actually originates with the University of Chicago, which dated these buildings to the Middle Bronze Age 1 in their publication, which of course at the time was what we now would call intermediate Bronze Age. Okay. In addition to the pottery from the foundation, I lost my words. From the pottery from the foundation trench of the front wall of the temple, we also excavated a foundation deposit directly in front of the threshold to the side chamber of Temple 4040 here. When it was originally published in Megiddo 3, the deposit itself, which consists of pottery, which I'm about to show you, was thought to date to the early Bronze Age 1. Now that particular season, 1994, and then partially in 1996, when this cache was first discovered, was really this was the first square that we had in the upper Acropolis here. So we had a very poor understanding of the stratigraphy, which became much more clearer over the course of the next decade of excavations. And now we understand this Egyptianizing pottery cache as belonging to a foundation deposit for Temple 4040. Many of you have seen this before. I would just make note that with the stratigraphic interpretation of these belonging to the EB1, meaning they were so deep in a pit that they seem to be contemporary with the earlier Great Temple. Early commentators on the pottery, including Alex Jaffe and others, were really hard pressed to find ceramic parallels for these structures, either locally or in Egypt. And that was because they were primarily looking at late pre-dynastic, early dynastic forms. Once we started to realize that this is possibly a foundation deposit and to expand our range looking for forms, it became pretty clear that this type of pottery assemblage as a group, but also individual forms, were much more characteristic of the first intermediate period in Egypt. I show you as one example these 4 foundation deposits from the mortuary temple of Montuhotep II in Deir el-Bahri in Thebes. This is an important observation because in the foundation deposits of Montuhotep, in his entire structure, he actually changed the method or the tradition of foundation deposits. And so we have a typological break where the early construction material at his temple had foundation deposits, which has groups of pottery similar as an assemblage to what we have from Megiddo. But in the latter part of his reign, as he expanded the temple and changed to a very different form of foundation deposits with different types of pottery altogether in use, different types of deposits, including amulets and jewelry and sacrificed animals, which would become standard type of foundation deposits for the rest of Egyptian history. So what we find at Megiddo in comparison with Montuhotep II really gives us a terminus antiquem for the Megiddo material. Because if an Egyptian is constructing a foundation deposit, he's not going to do it like this once the middle of the reign of Montuhotep first starts. Now we can draw parallels to other pieces here, including these bottles and these smaller bowls and these dishes. I give you one example from some of my excavations in Egypt from the first intermediate period. You can see some striking similarities between these things as well. These are very typical first intermediate period types of forms. Excuse me. Okay, also with respect to the temples themselves, the architectural layout of these buildings is also not local. I know Maura Sala, who's here, probably disagree with me, and you might be tempted to draw parallels with the earlier EB3 temple that I showed you reconstructed earlier, and with the Zerakun temples as well. Although I think that there is a distinct difference in the shape here, where the earlier temples are more of a broad room shape with a different kind of porch, and these follow much more in line with the Levantine in Antis temples that we see much farther to the north. Examples abound in Syria. Here are some examples in the northern Euphrates for you. The closest example to Megiddo in terms of distance is Byblos, where I like to point out that they in the temple the L-shaped temple at Byblos also occurs in a group of 3. Okay, so Megiddo is very much an anomaly during this particular period, and we're still wrestling with what to make of this, but I can say a few things or summarize a few things here. We have a northern style of temple, which, by the way, I should say, all the ones in Syria are dated to the EB4, that is the Intermediate Bronze Age from our point of view. It is all after 2500. The best parallel in terms of its triplicate structure is at Byblos, so the Byblos temples are a bit smaller. We have
Matt, just 5 more minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Yeah.
We have an Egyptian style foundation deposit that fits typologically in terms of the pottery itself into the first intermediate period. The kind of foundation deposit as a group we can find already in the 5th dynasty with slightly different morphological shapes, but I think ours at Megiddo fits much better into the latter part of that period. And if you force me to put a label on it, a chronological label, I'm tempted to see a Heracleopolitan era, 22nd century BCE era date for these temples and foundation deposit itself. And I'll just remind you, of course, that there are more than 50 tombs from the Intermediate Bronze Age on the east slope of Megiddo. This should not be surprising that Megiddo also has a cultic stratum of some significance as well. Okay, now my last point that I want to bring up here is to draw your attention again to altar 4017 and to the wall behind the double temple complex here. I think I have more slides than I need to make my case here, but as you can see from this aerial image, the double temple complex is cut down deeply into the underlying strata. And you can see all of these walls here are part of the EB3 building. Here you see the EB3 temple that I've argued for here, and this long passageway, and the deep cutting of the double temple complex here. If I show you an example of the same image in section, you can see that all of this earlier EB3 stratigraphy, over which we have the rear wall behind the temple and the deep foundations of the double temple complex here, more than a meter cut into the earlier strata. A couple of other examples just to remind you that there is a huge slope from north to south and from west to east here. And I bring this up. Here's the west to east. Here showing you the temples and how far deeply they go over here, more than 2 meters deeper in the west than the foundations in the east. And if you follow the trajectory of both of the slopes that from north to south and west to east that the architects of the double temple complex had to negotiate, it seems quite clear from my point of view that altar 4017 is already covered by the time the triple temple complex is created. And this makes a lot of sense in terms of the walls that we see surrounding the building here, all of which you can go investigate it in the site yourself today, are cut by the walls of Temple 4040. Some other views just showing you the deep cutting and how all of this EB3 architecture behind the temples is, of course, much higher, in some cases higher than the levels of the triple temple complex, in some cases about the same level because of the deep cutting that took place here. So what this observation has allowed us to do is to kind of rejigger or jigger for the first time maybe the stratigraphy of the area behind the triple temple complex, in particular the area of the altar, and shift all of these later strata downward. Here I've eliminated the altar, and I've taken what's known as locus 4009, which is normally associated with stratum 14, and put it where I think it belongs with these temples here. And to go with that, I show you some of the items that were recovered from this locus. It's long been known as the only intermediate Bronze Age locus in all of Megiddo. You see some of the pottery here on the left. I admit there's a Naharia style lamp here, which Asaf may want to mention, but I think our dating of these triple temple complex to very late into the 22nd century allows for some overlap here. Of course, this fenestrated axe, which comes reused in the later building here, which probably originated here.
One more minute. Okay.
Got it. And this foreign imported axe, which could be as early as early Minoan III, although there is possibly an Anatolian connection here slightly later. With that, I just want to mention an upcoming conference that the Albright and others are hosting, in which I'll be talking about this in particular intermediate Bronze Age stuff in more detail. You can check it out. And finally, that's it. This is what I believe to be the definitive stratigraphy of early Bronze Age Megiddo's cultic architecture. There are implications of some of this re-stratification for the early and later Middle Bronze Age cultic stratigraphy, but I will deal with those in a different context. Thank you.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. We'll save questions for the end of the session.